What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 2 of Tireside Chats. And with this episode, what I wanted to do was to try to make it a little bit easier on the people in the world that either want to be a race car driver at all, or maybe already know they want to be a Formula V driver and just don't know which Formula V they should race. Specifically vintage. I will say this will all be vintage centric because that's the type of racing that I know the most about, because that's the type of racing I do. And I've seen enough of, I feel like, the cars to get a general sense of how to guide someone through that process, at least a little bit. Maybe not from the most in-depth technical tidbits, but the general overview of most of the different types of cars that we see in vintage Formula V fields. Because I think when you're first getting into, or when you're first wanting to get into racing, it feels like you gotta have like compromising photos of Roger Penske in order to get anything actually done, when in reality it's not that hard, but it does take some extra information and some information gathering. So instead of you having to go pit to pit gathering that information yourself, I was going to do my best to put this all together in one video. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, so why vintage Formula V racing? First, we'll kind of address that. I would say there's actually a pretty, maybe 4 or 5 things that vintage V racing does particularly well, at least in the United States, that I think is appealing and would be appealing to anybody who's trying to get into racing. One, competitive or large fields, and I talked a little bit about this in the first video, anyways, but I'll still kind of reiterate some of it. But we have, because vintage V racing is pretty accessible from a price point perspective comparative to other racing. The fields tend to be pretty good. Like 20 plus is usually what you'll see at any average, like just, you know, our typical weekend series or whatever you want to call them. At the big events, like when we have feature races and things like that, you'll see 30 plus, and you know, at the big events, you'll see 40 plus. But so that's one thing I think Formula V has a very strong part of its application is just large fields, and one of the coolest things about those fields too is, even though it kind of has this feel like the competitive balance is well done, because a lot of those cars are from the same era and they're using the same sets of technology. They're just variants on like chassis styles and those sorts of things. So you have a field of a bunch of different looking cars, all pretty well competitively balanced. Like they're all capable of doing well if taken care of properly. All the different types of cars, that is. And so those are 2 things that lend themselves to good racing and to good racing groups. I'd say the other stuff that like I said earlier, cheap running costs. I mean, comparative to other types of racing, at least, it is a cheap running cost. Like, you know, you can rent cars too, because there's so many V's in the world, or because vintage V has become so accessible. You know, there's just in our organization alone, there's 3 different groups that will rent out V's, or rent or run your car for you while you essentially just do an arrive and drive. They bring the car, or you can bring the car, and then you show up and race that weekend essentially. And if anything goes wrong, you have the support at the track to go, you know, through that process. So that, I'd say that's probably one of the biggest deals, is because there's so many of these cars, and there's such a already a tight group that has been building over the last, you know, really, I mean, if you really want to get that, like, you know, 40, 50 years, but especially over the last 10 years, you have a support system no matter what, as long as you're at the track, essentially. You know, as long as your car makes it, you're going to be fine. So that offers, for a bunch of newbies, and so that was something that was my problem, and continues to be my problem, is the lack of technical knowledge. So to work on a car requires a history with those cars, really. I mean, and you gotta be around them all the time. You gotta be interested in being around them. You gotta be interested in learning how to fix them. And that's part of the process, I think, of kind of transitioning from, you know, hey, I wanna go racing, to I want to be my own team too, or, you know, like, you know, I'm the driver, I'm the engineer, and I bring the car to the track, and it's a different skill set. It just is, and so you gotta be able to you gotta take the time and the effort to develop that over time. Now, that's kind of a side tangent, but my point was cheap running costs overall, right? So that's one of the reasons why it tends to be pretty popular. The other thing is the camaraderie is always fantastic, at least in every group I've ever been. I've raced with a few different groups around the United States, and each time the Formula V crowd tends to be the biggest party and the most fun and the nicest. I mean, we're just, it's not that the other groups aren't nice. It's just that, you know, we're out there a lot. You know, Formula V people tend to stay in Formula V for a long time. You know, something I heard someone else say at some point was, you know, a lot of these other formula groups are kind of like stepping stones into larger worlds of formula racing. You know, hey, you put a 16-year-old kid in a Formula Ford so that they can be an 18-year-old kid in a Formula 4 and be an Indy car by the time they're 20. You know, like that's like kind of the goal. With Formula V, a lot of the people tend to stick around. Like, you don't start in Formula V, you usually start in Formula Ford, you know. And it used to be a little bit different, you know, like in the 60s and when you hear about Sam Posey being in Formula V and some of the up-and-comers, Nicky Lauda, that kind of thing. This was one of the stepping stones. It just eventually kind of moved its way to Formula Ford overall. But because of that, the groups tend to stick together for a long amount of time. So the people know each other over that amount of time, you know. And so it builds the camaraderie, and there's usually, you know, every organization I've been to has done some sort of, there's the party for the group, for the overall organization, and then there's also a party for the Formula V group, like, you know, maybe the day before the big party. So to give some more proof of what we're talking about like large fields and a competitive environment. I mean, you're going to see, I don't know which corner I'm putting up over, but there's a video from our 55th anniversary that shows us at Hallett with, I think it's like 40 cars. Initially, I think we had like 47 or something like that, but at that point, I think we had 40 or so. And yeah, it's a lot of cars, and it's a lot of fun, especially when we're able to put something like that together. So I'm going to let that play for a few more seconds. You've decided, whoever you are, you want to buy a Formula V, and you want to get involved and whatnot. The next part, there's a lot of parts to this, but the part that's at least the most fun and most interesting is deciding which car you want to buy, right? So there's a lot of different types of cars, and I'm going to go through what I would say is the most popular types. There's a lot of one-offs. There's a lot of people making a lot of different Formula Vs, you know, since the early 1960s, since 63. So it doesn't mean that I'm covering every one. In fact, I'm throwing some in there too that are like more rare, that most likely you won't be able to get a hold of anyways. But it's cool to know that they exist, and I think that's cool anyways. There's a lot of one-offs too that, like I was saying earlier, that were built to be specifically competitive and ended up being very, very competitive and are still competitive today. I won't necessarily dive into each one of those though, but I am, because those are difficult cars to get a hold of anyway. So we wanted to talk about the cars that you most likely will see on Apex Speed or Race Car Junk or whatever, you know, racing, I guess it's racingjunk.com, and all over the place. Or Bring a Trailer. Some of them have been sold on Bring a Trailer. So I'm going to name them first, like as the group, and then I'll go through each one, and I'll put a picture up and all that kind of stuff. But the categories I want to go over for each one too, to a certain extent at least, so the best that I can address them would be cost, the history of that car. So if, you know, I'll come back to this, but the history, like the background of how that car was created and whatnot. The ease of maintenance. There's not a whole lot of differences between the cars in this sense, because they're all Volkswagen parts. That's what the V stands for in Formula V. So overall, they're just easier cars to work on no matter what, as long as you have access to Formula V parts, right? But there are some differences between the cars when it comes to ease. And once again, I'm not a technical. I just talked to who I think are some of the best mechanics, V mechanics in the country, just to get kind of some basics on what these cars, what the differences might be. You know, what you should expect if you were to get this versus that. Performance is another category I want to talk about, because Racing is about winning sometimes. Now in vintage racing, it's not always about winning, right? So sometimes the cars are the stars, as we all like to say, and it has been said many, many times, especially to Group 3, our Formula Vs, because we tend to get a little racier than the rest of the groups. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about is fit to a certain extent. Like, Formula Vs are not comfortable cars most of the time, and so there's different types of, if you're a bigger guy, like I'm 6 foot, like 215, I'm about to talk about this too, but I own a Lynx, or a Caracal, and I barely fit in that car. Like, that car is like a little metal torture chamber. But so there's just different cars that are more comfortable for different types of people, essentially. And so I'll try to give you some sense of that. So if you're a bigger guy, taller than 6 foot, for example, there's a number of cars that would be a little bit better for you, or at least inherently better for you. It doesn't mean that a car can't be adjusted to fit you a little bit better. But anyways, we'll talk about that. So fit's the last thing. Now, but to go back a little bit, I'm going to talk about performance because performance was super important to me. It's about, vintage racing, it's about good, hard, clean racing, and clean being the most important word in the sentence. So if you can't race clean, then it's not really the group for you. That's kind of the deal. So, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that performance is number one for everybody. For a lot of people, performance is not number one. For a lot of people, the history of the cars is important. And just understanding that you're from an era that was so rich in racing history. I mean, the 1960s and 70s is essentially considered the golden age of racing in almost every type of racing, between the Can-Am, IndyCar, or the Indy 500 was in its heyday. Everything was hot, and so being able to participate or working with those cars from that era has its own sense of legitimacy. Even if you decide, hey, like I said, I'm not going after the fastest car in the pack. I'm here to go drive a cool car as hard as I can on this track today, that kind of thing. But okay, so let's jump into it. Okay, so the different types of Formula Vs that I'm going to address in this video. We're going to start with a form car. We're going to do Lynx, Zinc, Autodynamics, Callisons, Beaches, or the Beach Formula V, and Caldwell Formula Vs as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go kind of car by car, put a picture up of that car, so you kind of at least have a general idea of what I'm referencing, and then go from there. So I imagine this, if you're not somebody who's been doing this for 30 or 40 years, or either in vintage or in current SCCA Formula Vs, you might have questions. Most of these people, a lot of the people who might see this probably know a lot about these cars already. For the people that don't, this might raise some other questions. I'm going to put my email in the description of the video too, so if you want to send an email and ask questions, if I don't know the answer to it, which is entirely possible, I'll send it to the person that I know will know it, because there are a lot of those people too, and we'll do our best to get it answered for you. Alright, so let's start with the form car, the original Formula V, made in 1963. And all the research that I'm going to be kind of spewing out about the different Vs that we're going to be talking about, I have to give credit to Bill Wolf, my father, who has done a bunch of research recently in order to write an article about some of the grassroots American history of and the history of the people who not only started in Formula Vs, but then what they went on to do after they got done with Formula V. I mean, like the manufacturers and things like that. So So thanks for the information. This makes this a lot easier, because it's not like there's really a great database of Formula V info out there in the world right now. So the form car. So it was kind of the brainchild of Hubert Brundage, who wanted to make a Formula Junior that was made out of Volkswagen parts. And he thought, in order to essentially combat the same things that the United States Racing Series were combating, which is the rising cost of essentially running a race car. So it's like, so if we use Volkswagen parts, it'll be a less expensive experience. We can blah blah blah. We can make a thing out of it. So, but he wanted it to be less expensive but still competitive. It turned out his Volkswagen Formula Junior was not competitive. So he and then also Volkswagen essentially put out a cease and desist to tell him to stop making race cars because at that time, even in America as well, everybody was all the manufacturers were essentially saying that racing was, we had to do a cease and desist on racing across the board. Like the manufacturers couldn't be involved in the series. So between all that happening, he decided to quit, and he sold the two quote unquote form cars, or the Volkswagen Juniors, to for $1 each. He sold them both for $1 each to some sailboat racers. I believe they were American, and then they kind of took it from there and turned it into a kit that could be bought and sold, and could turn it into a real racing series. In 1964, I believe that's when the SCCA started recognizing it as a racing group. So. The form car holds a special place in a lot of people's hearts because, like I said, it's the original. It's without the existence of the form car, the rest of it doesn't happen. And so it's you have two kind of sides to this. If we're talking about, because in order to kind of address performance and history for the form car inside the same few sentences, the performance of a form car is typically less important because you're really dealing, like I said, with the most historical of all the Formula V's. And they weren't particular. Not that many of the Formula V's are particularly aerodynamic, anyways. But this one is particularly non-aerodynamic, and we have some pictures of that I'll be showing of that you're probably looking at right now of the form car. So. From a history perspective, top notch. You know, if we're grading on a 5-star scale, we're at 5 stars for history. When you're dealing with a form car, if we're doing a performance evaluation, typically, as you're going to see in a graph that I put together for all the podium finishes and I'm going to bring this up in the next card that I'm about to talk about. But for all the podium finishes in our group, CVAR, Corinthian Vintage Auto Racing. Since 2016, I did an evaluation of all the podium finishes, first through third. That car, or a form car, got 4 podiums during that time, and typically in the rain, and driven by somebody who's very good driving in the rain too. So you won't necessarily expect to win championships and races in a form car, but that's usually not the point of driving a form car. So there you go. Cost, when it comes to cost, they can actually be kind of on the higher end of the scale. You see a really wide variance in this because it's like in V's in general, you know, because they'll range from $2,000 to $19,000. Like it just depends, even in the vintage world, that is. So the form car tends to be on the higher end of that scale, but you know, you typically, I think that, I mean, you know, somewhere between 10 and 15,000, depending on like which serial number it has and who drove it, and those sorts of things obviously dictate that. So you would expect for the most historical V that you'll be on the higher end of the price scale, I would say overall. From an ease of workmanship or an ease of maintenance, it is actually on the highest end. It is one of the easiest cars to work on because they're so big. Like they just have so much room to walk or to work inside the car. Like you don't have to take the whole car apart to change an engine. You don't. It's just easy to move around. Essentially, you don't have to take 3 or 4 things off in order to change something else. It just tends to be easier to work on because of the extra room. Fit, all that also lends itself to being an easy car to fit in if you're tall or you're a big guy. So from that perspective, it checks a lot of boxes for a lot of people. Because it's compared to a lot of the other V's, it's comfortable. Price is typically right. You feel like you're really involved in the history of the sport, and they're easier to work on. All right, so moving on to the Lynx. Which is the car I happen to own, so I will attempt to hide some of my bias here in this situation. It was built in kind of the brainchild of Bob Riley and John Mills, who were working for the Ford Motor Company and were actually working on the weekends to create this Formula V. Ended up being a gigantic hit, and from 1969 through 1971, they built about 40 of them, or built and sold about 40 of them. Bob Riley would also go on to do a lot in motorsports, which you guys would be able to read in the article that my dad's putting together for Victory Lane, I believe, the magazine Victory Lane, and. Probably, I mean, just like an example, Bob Riley went on to design the 1977 Indianapolis 500 winning car for A.J. Foyt, and then participate in IMSA. The company still participates in IMSA today, even Riley Technologies. So had a really illustrious set of inventors, I guess the Lynx does. Now, this is, I'll have to tie two things in together again. So, performance and cost. Lynxes tend to be considered the highest performance car of that era of Formula V. They tend to be lower to the ground. They tend to be a little twitchier. They tend to be on the correct side of the a little bit of oversteer side of the steering spectrum. So what most people tend to think is that if you're going to be on one side or the other, like the perfect setup car is the car that oversteers just a little bit, so it helps with the rotation and getting through all sorts of different types of corners, but usually slow corners too. So in general, I'm not really going to speculate on necessarily why it's considered to be one of the or like what it is about the car that makes it so competitive. But when you look through a field of competitors, throughout a whatever group you happen to be running with in CVAR or in VSCDA, there tends to be the front end of the pack tends to be comprised of Lynxes and a few other cars too, but Lynxes tend to be pretty close to the top most of the time. So when I was deciding what kind of car I wanted, I bought a Lynx that had already been very successful, and I had also seen what other groups, like you go and if you just look at result sheets in groups from around the United States, there tends to be Lynxes at the top of the field at a pretty consistent rate. The other things about them, one, they're pretty cool looking cars. They're sleek. They got kind of the pointed nose compared to some of the other cars in the field. They are also pretty well known for being easier to work on. You don't have to, in order to pull an engine, you don't have to like disconnect the two sides of the car. You don't have to take the rear end off. I think what most people say, for most Lynxes, what you have to do is you just have to move the seat up and the gas tank in order to pull the engine, which is a pain, but it's not as bad as some of the other types of Vs that can really make it an all-day process to pull an engine. So relatively easy to work on overall. Most people tend to think that it's just a nice or a predictable experience when you're working on a Lynx, at least. The cost, because of how well they perform typically, the cost of Lynxes tend to be on the highest end of the spectrum. You'll see ones listed, they're rarely listed for less than $11,000. It's like 11 to, I think there's one right now listed at like 17.5 or 18,000. So you would expect to pay top dollar for a top car, usually. If your goal is to go out and win, and you want to deal with cars that you see frequently at the track, the Lynx will typically be the number one choice, I would say. It's not that other cars can't compete with it, and you'll see this when I'm about to bring up this graphic here. What you're going to see is a graphic right now that brings up all the podium finishes since 2016 in our group, in the group that I run with. So this is it's not supposed to be conclusive completely. I understand that there's other groups throughout the country that I probably could have also pulled information from. It also has a lot to do with with the drivers themselves, of course, and the circumstances in which they're under. But what you'll see is the Lynx has by far the most podium finishes overall in the group. But what you'll also see is that it's possible for a lot of different types of cars to compete. So you're going to see 50-ish finishes, podiums for Zinc. For Zincs, that is another really popular car that I'm going to talk about. Beaches had 27. Callisons, there's not a lot of those, but they're going to be second on the list at 59 because we have two of them in our group who are very competitive. Caldwells are also in the mix, finishing in the top group at a relatively frequent rate. There's another group just called Other, which is made up of a lot of different things. Mostly one-off cars. There's things like the Warrior and the Pegasus that run in our group that are one-off cars built to be particularly competitive, and they succeeded at that. So they themselves, I mean, just those two cars alone have something like 45 finishes or podium finishes. But it's not necessarily worth highlighting those from a consumer standpoint because it's going to be really hard to get those cars. You also see the Form car in there. It was like I was talking about earlier that had 4 podiums since 2016. So once again, it's not. I'm not saying this is a conclusive data. It has a lot to do with drivers. It's just an interesting piece of data that I think helps illustrate that one, you can compete in anything. It's possible to compete in anything to be competitive. If you want to play the odds, the Lynx will give you the best odds at being competitive, I would say. After saying that and making it not necessarily divisive, let me also then say that anybody who's willing to drive balls to the wall and has a good engine in their car, has an engine that's at least relatively fresh, can compete in all of these series throughout the country. That's what's so cool about Formula V in general, is that as long as you're willing to drive it hard and clean, remember clean, but hard, and put a good engine in that car, that's all you really need in order to be competitive. And when I say good, I mean, like I said, a fresher engine is typically what you need. So that being said, that's the Lynx. Oh, let me back up. Not back up, but continue with the fit. For example, I talked about the Lynx's fit. You're not gonna. Don't assume that if you're over 6 foot, you're gonna be able to fit into the car. You're gonna have to go test it most likely if you're looking at a car to buy. That's what I would say, is you need to be able to get in and see exactly what level of misery you're going to be putting yourself in. But what's crazy about race car fits too is that anything that you feel is uncomfortable when you're just sitting in there casually, you do tend to adjust to when the race is actually happening. Like, yeah, I get in every time and I'm always like, oh, this is so brutal. And then 15 minutes, like literally a minute and a half into doing the pace lap, I have completely forgot about all the difficulties I might have had, sitting in it otherwise. You just adapt because you're there to go racing. So it's just a real tight fit. So we're kind of at the two ends of the spectrum when it comes to comfort too, between the Form car and the Lynx. You're the most comfortable in a Form car, you're probably the least comfortable in the Lynx. If you're under 6 foot and you're under 200 pounds, you are probably set in a Lynx also. You're going to be just fine. But once again, it's always good to test it before you get in, and there's all sorts of different ways to make you more comfortable. I put padding in the bottom of mine, and that of course makes a world of difference when you're initially miserable just sitting in it without a suit on when you're first testing it out. Okay, so moving on to Zincs. These tend to be the other most popular type of car you see at most Formula V race weekends. So it's usually you see a lot of Lynxes and you see a lot of Zincs, or you see a lot of those types of cars also available for sale on various websites, Apex Speed, all the ones we talked about earlier. So you'll see a lot of them. The Zinc C or the Zinc Z5 tends to be the one you see the most. Zincs were super dominant. They were built by Ed Zink. They were super dominant in the late 60s, like 67 and 68. And I think what people seem to think is that they were so dominant that rules were put in place to try to combat them a little bit to make other things more competitive. Eventually the Lynx came along at the end of the 60s and spice things up a bit, along with I'm sure a number of other cars. But they were very dominant, and they're very competitive today. The other thing that the Zinc does really well is it fits people. Like, it's just one of those cars that big guys can fit in, tall guys can fit in. It just is easy to fit, which is what appeals to a lot of people. So you can still be very competitive, and you can be comfortable too. A lot of good paint jobs on Zincs. Like, they're just, for some reason, easier to paint. I don't know. Or easier to put a good paint job on. I don't know what the deal is with that. But I feel like a lot of the Zincs are some of the sharpest looking cars that we have in the field. From an ease of maintenance standpoint, it's a little iffy. These tend to be some of the harder ones to work on because, once again, like, they're all Volkswagen parts. So it's not necessarily a higher technical ability. It's a amount of work needed to be done. So, like, you have to take the rear end off of most Zincs in order to change the engine in it, for example. And that tends to be the thing that I talked about the most with a lot of the mechanics that I talked to. That being said, there's a lot of them in the world. There's a lot of people who do work on them, so it's clearly possible. But it is, if we're going to rank it, it's going to be closer to the bottom as far as cars that are easier to work on. Like I said, fit's good. Performance is damn good too. I mean, there's a lot of, like I said, you look at the list of podium finishes in our group, and you're going to see about 50 podiums since 2016 in a very competitive group. So it clearly can compete. It just needs the right driver and the right engine. That's the real deal. History's there too, to a certain extent, but like I said, I think, in my experience, when talking with people overall, it's not so much the history that motivates people to get into Formula V. The only history that I hear about frequently is the form car. That's because it's the primordial beginnings of the Formula V. So that's the Zinc for you. All right, so moving on to the Callison, which we don't know a whole lot about, or at least I don't know a whole lot about, and there's not a lot of information on the World Wide Web about. I'm sure there's people in this world who do, so if you have some information, historical information, you can drop it in the comments. But from a performance standpoint, it appears that Callisons are just as fast and are as fast as anything, and can certainly compete in pretty much any vintage competition, any vintage race weekend, essentially. In our group, we have 2 of them. Apparently, the ones we know of, there's about, as far as what we know, there are 4 currently racing, 2 in the VSCDA group and 2 in CVAR in our group, and they all are pretty competitive. So there's reason to believe that any Callison would be pretty competitive in a vintage group. Will you be able to get a hold of one? Probably not, but it's just one of those. It's a cool looking car. The guy did a great job on its bodywork and designs, and so we know from a performance standpoint it's pretty damn good. Fit is a little suspect. I think it's supposed to be kind of similar. It's certainly more comfortable than Lynx, but just kind of depends on the car because they all tend to be pretty different overall. Ease of maintenance is not great, but it also depends on which Callison you're dealing with, apparently, because modifications have been made to different Callisons that have made them either more difficult or easier to work on. So it's this one's kind of all over the map. I just wanted to bring them up. They're cool looking cars. You'll see in the picture, and then give you an idea that if you ever get the opportunity to buy one and you want to be competitive, it is clear that they're capable of it. I don't know. I mean, cost, because they're so rare and they're pretty competitive, would probably be pretty high, at least in the V world. So certainly, between, like I said, kind of similar to the form car, between 10 and 15. So yeah, that's everything I'm going to talk about the Callison, because there's not a whole lot to say. Moving on, we're going to talk about the Beach next. Okay, so the Beach, built by Gene Beach, who built a lot of different types of race cars, typically Formula Fords and sports racers from the 60s and 70s. Built a number of different Formula Vs also, as early as 1963 apparently, so he got into the series really early as well. and they were competitive as early as 1965. But you have a lot of what you will typically see is what Gene Beach called the Mach 5C, and that's the one you see in most groups racing today. So I think like the late 60s is when that really became the streamlined pick for the beach world. But super competitive, as you can tell even from the graph. We've had I think 4 different beaches competing in CVAR over the last few years, and I think they're all Mark 5Cs, but I probably have to do some more research on that. But clearly very competitive. That has never been the problem with the beach. It fits all right. There's tall people that can fit in them. They seem to be pretty easy to work with in that sense. Once again, not a form car and not a zinc, but also not quite as miserable as a Lynx. So performance is good, fits pretty good. The history that if you're a fan of Formula car history, that tends to be pretty high up there too. I mean, like I said, just because of Gene Beach's involvement in other types of racing, the cost seems to be about the same as any of the other competitive. Just a lot of it depends on the quality of upkeep, essentially. Because the thing that beaches tend to get knocked on the hardest is that they're difficult. They're not necessarily difficult to work on. Like they're easy. They're just as easy to work on as some of these other cars. But the materials that they were made out of tend to atrophy quicker than the materials that you'd make a Lynx out of, for example. So frame cracks tend to be a thing you got to keep up with more. There's just more upkeep in general. A lot of people think beaches might be the best looking of the Formula V groups as well. So there's kind of you get with the negative aspect of it being difficult to work with and lighter, or because the materials are lighter, they atrophy quicker. But you look pretty cool. Well, if you get your car squared away, you look pretty great in it, or it's a great looking car. So that's kind of my super quick spiel on beaches. There's not a whole lot of them available. I think, like I said, I've only seen 4 ever, I think, in my 4 years of racing. But it's another car to keep a lookout on, and they'll occasionally pop up, and a lot of them need to be refurbished and redone and that kind of thing. And you just want to make sure you're checking for frame cracks, because that tends to be a thing that happens to beaches. All right, so moving on to Caldwell / Auto Dynamics, because they are essentially the same company. Ray Caldwell started Auto Dynamics in 1964, and so a lot of the early cars, and this is where things are a little muddy, a lot of the early cars that he made are called Auto Dynamics, and then the later cars that were so if he started in 1964, he actually won the national championship and the Rookie of the Year in 1964. Ray Caldwell did in an Auto Dynamics that he had built. By the late 60s, he started calling his cars Caldwells. So you have things like the Ford D9, which was a Formula Ford that was also competing in 1969. But the Caldwell that you see the most in today's racing, in today's vintage racing, that is the Caldwell D13. So it's called a Caldwell, but it could technically also be called an Auto Dynamics, most likely. So you'll see, it's just kind of a different lineage. Like if it's an earlier days Formula V, it'll be called Auto Dynamics. Later on, it'll be called a Caldwell. So I'll talk about both. You've seen. I've driven 3 different Formula Vs. I've driven a Lynx, an Auto Dynamics, a 1964, I believe, 1964 Auto Dynamics, and then a zinc also. So to first start with the Auto Dynamics side, because of the earlier technology, I would say everything that was in the 64, 65, 66 era tends to be a little bit slower performance-wise, or more difficult to get it into the higher level performance rings compared to things that were built in 68, 69, 70, 71, 72. And that's the case with the Auto Dynamics. If you have an Auto Dynamics from those earlier years, chances are it's really fun. It's fun to drive, and I would say easier to drive. There's not a lot of risk. You don't feel like you can really push the car past its limits. It's really hard to spin it usually. There's a lot of typically you're going to be battling understeer with a autodynamics, which I think is also one of the things the Lynx has going for it, but it's just faster still. Anyways. So when it comes to learning how to drive a Formula V, it's a great starting point because, and like I said, that's what I learned how to drive a Formula V, or that's what I learned. That's what I was in when I was learning to drive Formula V. And so that's a great place to start. It's a great car. It's a easy to work on, fun car to drive. Just not necessarily top of the line competitively. It's just part of the gig. Because most of the ones you see tend to be from the earlier years of the class. So when you transition in the Caldwell years, the D13 tends to be the one that's the most popular, and that's what I'll put a picture of up. The driver straight up almost lays down in it, so they're not super accommodating for tall people. It can be difficult to fit into them sometimes. It just kind of depends on the car again. And I was like, one of these things that's like, I know it's uncomfortable in the Lynx, no matter what Lynx it is overall, but you can make adjustments to make people less uncomfortable. And that's this case in every car. So I wouldn't anticipate being super comfortable in it, but it also will give you the ability to maneuver. So anyways, you're laying down pretty flat. Aerodynamics were pretty interesting for that time. You see a lot of Caldwells continue to develop for a couple more years until autodynamics went under in the mid 70s. But they're fast. They're from a performance standpoint, you're capable of being as far up as you're able to drive it. You know, it's like if you're driving hard, you'll be in the top group in a D13 Caldwell. It appears that from an ease of maintenance, it's kind of middle of the pack. You know, it just kind of depends on the car. Sometimes you can actually, you don't have to take apart the rear end. Once again, it goes back to changing an engine, but you don't have to take apart the rear end. I think the mechanic that I talked to that works on one the most frequently talked about having to loosen bolts so that you could flex the chassis a little bit to open it up so you could get the engine out. There's things like that you have to do, but it's not quite as high impact as it would be on a Zinc or or a Callison or something of that nature. So that's that side of it. I think from a history standpoint, it's really interesting because Ray Caldwell went on to compete in the Can-Am, which most people feel is like some of the coolest racing that ever happened ever. Him and Sam Posey, he built a Caldwell for the Can-Am series, and Sam Posey ran it. Unfortunately, they weren't particularly successful in that endeavor. But the fact that he would start in Formula V, kind of cut his teeth there, and move on to Can-Am is a pretty damn cool story. And he did a lot of other things after that as well. Cost tends to be dependent upon quality of car again. I mean, like you won't pay top dollar just because it's a Caldwell. It'll just depend on the type of engine, how fresh the engine is in it, how successful it's been, if it's been run recently. But I'd say it's on the lower end of the spectrum when it comes to cost. And same with autodynamics. Autodynamics is probably the lowest cost cars out there because people know that you won't go up to the next level of the market knows, at least not like everybody knows these things, but the market knows that you won't necessarily be at the front of the pack running on autodynamics. So in conclusion, talking about the different types of cars, if you want to give yourself the best, you can win in any car you want to put the time in. That's what seems to be cool. What the coolest part about Formula V is that if you have the will to drive hard and you have a good engine in that car, you can compete in any group in the United States. That's what's so cool about it. If you want to give yourself the best odds to finish high, there are cars that you can buy that will give you the better odds. And I think what I've seen from not only our group, but from groups across the country, if you're racing a Lynx, if you're racing a Callison, a Caldwell, a Beach, or even a Zinc, and Zinc sometimes, you have an opportunity to win. If you want to give yourself the best odds, you pick a Lynx. If you can fit in a Lynx, that's the way to go the fastest. It's just how it is. That's just when you go to the two biggest events we've had in vintage Formula V in the United States this year, or not this year, over the last 4 years. One was the 55th anniversary we had at Hallett. The top two finishers are a Lynx won every race. And in the other biggest event we had at VSCDA at Blackhawk in 2019, when we had like 38 cars show up, not only did the Lynx win every race, in the first qualifying, in the first race that started, the top 5 spots were filled with Lynxes, and probably it's something like, 7 of the top 12 were Lynxes. Like, it's just one of those things. It's a competitive car. If you're trying to be competitive, it's a safe bet you'll be competitive in a Formula V, or I'm sorry, in a Lynx, if you're willing to to drive it really hard. So it's not saying that you can't be competitive in these other cars. It's clear you can be, but that's how you give yourself the best odds. If you're looking more towards the history side of the world, the form cars where you want to be, or the Caldwell, or something like that, that gives you kind of the credentials to say you're driving a really cool, historically significant race car. So, the deal is, get involved in Formula V. It's a really cool experience, and you got a lot of really cool people that you get to meet, and the racing's super fun, and for the most part, pretty clean. And I hope you see you out at the racetrack. Till next time, everybody.